We're glad you've stayed with us. Welcome back to the second part of your favorite Pan-African show, Bottomline Africa. Now, the Africa Group for Justice today convened an international symposium at the Strathmore Business School. The symposium, dubbed, quote-unquote, Networks of Accountability, brought together legal experts, human rights activists and other stakeholders to take stock, evaluate and discuss the status of international criminal justice. The panelists called for a multi-sectoral approach in ensuring accountability and justice for children and victims of sexual violence. Let's listen into what some of the participants there had to say.
What we're demanding for is state accountability for four things. One, the state's failure to prevent the violence in the first place. We all know there was NIS intelligence and so on. It was not acted upon. Secondly, the state's failure to protect civilians from attacks. Attacks including sexual violence, where the state had knowledge from numerous other conflict situations that in situations of conflict, certain vulnerable populations, the elderly, the children, women and girls, are likely to be attacked. No measures were put in place. Thirdly, the failure to conduct meaningful investigations that had the potential to result in prosecutions. So not just investigations like what we saw. We were very busy for 4 years doing a lot of stuff that could not yield accountability. And finally, the state's failure to provide reparations. These are the four key things that the state is obligated to do. What that requires at the
And in line with that, of course, that sets the tone for our discussion tonight, which has everything to do with Africa's justice system. In studio, once again, I have Navi Pillaya. She's a member of Africa Group on Justice and Accountability, also a former United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights. We also have Richard Godstone, who is a member of Africa Group on Justice and Accountability, also a former Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. We also have Bettina Mbach, who is the Director of Wayamo Foundation, an organization that helps build the capacity of national judicial systems and train judges, prosecutors, investigators, even we journalists. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the program. So let me begin with you, Navi, and they always say charity begins at home. So let me begin from the East African region. There's the East African community in place, which advocates, for member countries to move freely from one country to another. And of course, criminals also can take advantage and, get into these porous borders. So the East African community apparently has the East African Court of Justice, which is one of the key organs of EAC. But not so many people know about this court. And they're saying, critics say that this court is totally ineffective. So what do you think needs to be done to make sure that these kind of courts are effective?
Well, East Africa has a good history, actually. They had the first sub-regional court. Mm-hmm. The story with regional courts and also national jurisdictions is that they do need the support and funding from developed countries. Mm-hmm. That was always my message, because the intention is there. Africa supports the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Africa is against impunity for serious crimes. So having expressed such goodwill, I feel AGJA and Wayamo Foundation should do whatever we can to help train people so that these courts will have capacity.
Mm-hmm. Richard, do you believe that the East African courts have the capacity that Navi is talking about? And what needs to be done to make it much more effective?
Well, firstly, it needs support from government. Mm-hmm. It needs support from people. I think the clips that we saw in the first half of this program indicate that one can't generalize about a continent. Africa is a huge continent with many countries and many people. But what one can generalize on is that the victims cry for justice. Mm. And the victims in so many countries on our continent and other continents. And the only way they can get justice is through courts of law, bringing to justice the people who are responsible for the victimization. Mm-hmm.
Now, Bettina, let me play back that question to you as well. If the East African court perhaps is ineffective, as most people are saying, what does that say about, the justice system in the region, perhaps?
I think capacity building is needed all over the world. Mm-hmm. And my belief is really that the whole system is a system of justice, where you may have different layers of justice, and the East African Court or other regional courts need capacity building, and as you know, our organization, Vayamo, that's our main field where we are working in to strengthen domestic systems to deal with these complex crimes domestically.
Mm-hmm. Now, Navi, let's have a conversation revolving around the international criminal justice, and there's no way we're going to avoid the International Criminal Court, that is the ICC, because most African leaders have been saying that, ICC treats them unfairly, and perhaps they have a fact to that. If you look at the history of ICC, since 2002, that's when it was established, the court has had 22 cases and indicted 36 individuals up to 2015, and all of them finished the sentence come from Africa. And during the 23rd AU summit, all African countries, save for Botswana, actually expel or express their distrust in the institution. So what does this say about the relationship between ICC and Africa moving forward?
It is a matter for concern that there is these mistaken perceptions that the ICC is targeting African leaders. Mm-hmm. The 34 African leaders have ratified the Rome Statute. They have promised that they will support international criminal justice in situations where they are unable to provide remedies in their own countries. Mm. Now it's time to deliver on that. The ICC is only a court of last resort. Only if the countries in Africa do not put people up for trial who are suspected of serious crimes, or they are unable to do so, then the ICC steps in. So it's important to remember that the ICC, for instance, came into 5 countries, 5 African countries, at the request of those countries: Uganda, the DRC, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali. Mm-hmm. These countries could not deal with conflicts caused by rebel leaders. And you know that historically in Africa, we suffered from huge acts that affected thousands of lives in Africa. And there were no remedy because there was no international criminal court. So for particularly our continent, we welcome that finally we have a mechanism to which we can seek remedies. So it's not a question of targeting Africa or any country. The ICC investigates, and only the judges, I was a judge myself on the appeals court, the evidence is considered very, very carefully. There are many checks and balances for fair trials. Mm-hmm.
Let me hear Richard's view on this, who has been a prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals. Richard, do you agree with Navi, or you also buy into the thought that, Africans are targeted by the ICC?
I do agree with Navi. I think as an African, what I object to is a different issue. Mm-hmm. And that is that the most populous countries in the world are not involved in the ICC. Russia, China, India, and the United States of America are not members, and therefore their nationals don't come before the ICC. Mm-hmm. The Security Council has the power to refer countries to the ICC. Obviously, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council protect countries that they're friendly with, that might be embarrassing if they come before the court. Mm-hmm. So I think the objection as an African I have is there's an unfairness in the court being able to look into African and other countries, of course, because they're not only now African countries, there are investigations into Georgia, which could involve Russia, and also now Afghanistan. But there is an unfairness, and the answer is not to withdraw. Mm-hmm. I think the answer is to use African clout, whether it's in the United Nations or in other bodies, to try and bring on board all of these other countries, because that we need international justice, I don't think can be realistically queried.
Bettina, I'd like to hear your view on this, because at the moment it seems Africa and ICC have some sort of a frosty relationship.
No, I agree with the arguments of Richard, but I also would like to add, I think Definitely, there are problems. The court is not perfect, but I think to address them is not to talk about mass withdrawal, but rather to look for universal jurisdiction, so that the fundamental problem of the jurisdictional reach of the court can be addressed. So for me, the answer would be rather, let's have a constructive engagement, look at the problems, try to improve from within.
Now, Navi, at the 23rd AU summit once again, the president of Uganda, that is Yoweri Museveni, even threatened then to put forward a motion to have all African countries withdraw from the court. He was also supported by another unpopular figure in Africa, that is the then Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe, who supported, of course, Museveni's sentiments. So is the continent perhaps in danger of exposing itself to criminals or politicians out there to cause, harm to their citizens if they make good their threat of leaving the ICC?
Well, firstly, I note that there was talk of mass withdrawal in the AU, but that has not been proceeded with, and there is no resolution, in fact. I'm following events, and they are much more interested in getting ratifications for the Malabo Protocol so that Africa can take charge of its own justice mechanisms, such as the regional institutions. However, as Richard said, it's a mistake to respond by saying we're going to withdraw. ACJA is calling for universal ratification of the Rome Statute so that all countries will be subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC.
Now, Bettina, speaking about Uganda, I know you have an experience when it comes to matters East Africa. Uganda has already come up with an international crime division, well known as ICD there. What is it all about? Is it an alternative to ICC, perhaps?
The ICD in Uganda is one of the examples where countries in Africa have developed their domestic capacities. Part of the High Court, in fact, a similar model here in Kenya, it was debated, and hopefully still is debated, to have an international organized crimes division in Kenya. I think it is a very good idea. I believe also that a lot of the future of international criminal justice is national. That's why we believe so much in capacity building. An alternative to the ICC? No, I think these are systems which can and should work together. We need the international level, but as a court of last resort.
And Richard, let me get a quote for you here from the Transparency International. They had a report on the Global Corruption Barometer. And speaking about Uganda, they say the courts there are not sufficiently independent. Bribes and irregular payments in return for favorable judicial decisions are common. Nearly half of Ugandans perceive the judiciary as corrupt, and also nearly half of those who have come into contact with the courts in the past 12 months alone indicate having paid a bribe. So how can Africans trust, how can they have trust in this kind of a court system, especially in a court that, can be influenced by politicians, perhaps?
Well, I think there are two issues. There's a question of domestic jurisdiction, domestic judges, you talk about Uganda, and there's a question of regional or international justice. The International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. It cannot get involved in its jurisdiction doesn't apply to situations where domestic courts are doing their job. And this is of course the problem for some states, and not only in Africa. If their own judicial systems are not independent, are not efficient, and if fair trials cannot be put on in those countries, then of course justice cannot be done there, and the International Criminal Court is the only court that can step into the breach. I would love to see an African court of human and people's rights with criminal jurisdiction. Navi's referred to the Malabo Protocol. It's completely consistent with the whole ethos of the International Criminal Court, that there should be justice on the continents where crimes are committed. But there isn't the political will. Not a single, a number of countries have signed the protocol, but not a single country in Africa has ratified it. So it's really a pipe dream at the moment. unfortunately, in my view, to talk about an African court. And until there is an African court, and the sooner the better, the only option is the international criminal court.
Yes, well said, Richard. Now, Navi, let me put it this way. Will you regard perhaps the International Crime Division in Uganda as a success in Africa?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I'm asking Navi.
Oh,
Can you hear me, Navi?
Can hear you. Back to your question on Uganda, Yusuf, I hear you say that a great percentage of Ugandans do not believe that their judges are independent. Now, that's a serious situation, and there is a responsibility on the part of the government to ensure that they address this issue, because the judiciary must be independent. It's a key pillar of democracy, and people must be able to place trust in their judiciary. We have a good example in South Africa, but obviously we didn't have an independent judiciary under apartheid, and that's one of the greatest achievements that President Mandela did, is to ensure that properly qualified judges are elected in a transparent process. And this can be done in Uganda, and it should be done immediately, because if people do not have access to justice, which is a human right, then they are not enjoying democracy and all the other rights as well.
Now, Richard, you've talked about having indigenous or kind of African international court. There are two courts in place apparently in Africa, the African Human Rights Court, as well as the Court of Justice of the African Union. Perhaps if you look at the African Human Rights Court, it has only 27 out of 54 African countries who have so far ratified its protocol and are party to its jurisdiction. It seems Africans not only have a problem with ICC, they also have a problem with their own local courts.
Well, this is the point. You know, there's a lot of lip service done, unfortunately, amongst many African leaders, particularly in the African Union, talking about an African court, but really not doing anything about it. There's no political will, and there aren't the financial resources to make it a reality. And one's got to look at the facts, and those facts are there. And until that's occurred, as I say, at the cost of repetition, the only alternative is the International Criminal Court.
Bettina, do you agree with Richard that sometimes the ICC might be the only chance for Africans to get justice?
Definitely yes. If countries are not able and not willing, and there is no political will, I think these are the moments where the ICC has a role to play, and also should have this role of deterrence for these countries. But I would also like to stress that I think as much as it remains to be seen what will happen with the Malabar Protocol and the African Court, but there are other very encouraging developments, you know, the successful court in Senegal, the extraordinary chambers in Senegal, and the successful trial of Hissène Habré. Now, today, in fact, we heard from the representative from the African Union about the plans for the hybrid court in South Sudan. So I think you can also kind of underline that there are positive developments taking place.
Navi, I think I'll give you the last word. This is a Pan-African show. It's not all gloom and doom in Africa, I believe. And Africa apparently has been at the forefront in developing international criminal justice system, including the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, special courts of Sierra Leone. Perhaps what needs to be done to make sure Africans have such successful, perhaps, justice system in future?
We have good examples in Africa. As Bettina mentioned, look at the trial of Hissène Habré. That was at the insistence of the AU. The AU's own charter commits it to end impunity for serious crimes. So we have the framework, and as Richard said, there is a lack of political will here. He mentioned the lack of finance and seriousness about setting up the regional courts. And in fact, they've destroyed or stopped the SADC tribunal just because of a complaint from Mugabe of Zimbabwe. So those are negative features. It is possible for Africa to get together, African countries that is, and live up to the promise they made to all victims in South Africa, that Africa will take seriously its commitment to end impunity, to deliver justice, and to be accountable, to bring perpetrators to account for serious crimes.
And I think you'll have the last word. Many thanks for your input, Navi. Navi Pillay is a member of the Africa Group and Accountability, also former United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights. I also spoke to Richard Gonston, who is a member of Africa Group of Justice and Accountability, also a former Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Also in studio, I was Bettina Ambachu, is the Director of Wayamo Foundation, an organization that helps build the capacity of national judicial systems and train judges, prosecutors, investigators and journalists. Thank you all for your input. And before we wrap up the show tonight, let me take you over to our images of the day. Now, once a rare water sport activity, kayaking is gaining popularity in Lagos, Nigeria, a city that sits on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, as residents find new ways to explore this particular sport. Let me take you to the images there.
There's a boat limit.